it's really just not that bad. We don't have any real problems with what's going on. And actually, the few that have left the church are going to come back again like the swallows to Capistrano. So we're going to kind of take on some of those today, aren't we?
Definitely we are. And those type of questions are really what led us at Probe to look into this at a deeper level, because we were looking out there at what the sociologists were writing, the surveys that they were publishing data about, and we couldn't really tell what was true and what wasn't because they didn't all agree. And that's kind of makes you worry, when you take a position on that. And so we decided we were going to get into the data ourselves, because we saw things from people like, Bradley Wright in his book that Christians are hate-filled hypocrites and other lies you've been told. He wrote, there's no compelling evidence based on the data we have about our young people that the church in America is on the verge of collapse. So sounds like things are pretty good.
Yes.
And we looked at the things that the sociologists at Baylor were writing about their survey, and it sounded like, evangelicals are doing pretty well. Then we look at other surveys like Christian Smith and his survey that you mentioned earlier, and he did it over multiple years with young adults, and beginning when they were teenagers and then when they were young adults, and he painted a vastly different picture that things were really changing. There was a real change in society, and it wasn't like it was before. And then we, of course, dealt a lot with the Barna Group and Dave Kinnaman, who head that up, and their surveys were saying, things are changing, and not as many people are evangelical in their beliefs and behavior as they were before. And so we really wanted to get to the bottom of that. So over the last several years, about 8 years actually, we've analyzed surveys, the General Social surveys, the Pew Research that we talked about, Christian Smith surveys, Baylor surveys, Portraits of American Life, Faith Matters survey, and others that we're going to talk about today. And guess what we found? They all basically agree. They all basically say the same thing when you ask them the same questions.
Interesting.
And these are the same surveys that the Baylor people used, that Bradley Wright used, but they weren't asking the questions at the level of depth that Barna and Christian Smith and others were. And so when we got their surveys, got the data, looked at it, and analyzed it in a consistent fashion, we found out, guess what? All the surveys are consistent, which was a big sigh of relief, because if they're not consistent, then where do you go?
Where do you go?
Then you say, all right, well, we have a nation full of crazy people who don't know what they believe from one day to the next. But that's not the case. At least we have consistent data, but it does create a challenge for us. And that's one of the things I want us to focus on today as we talk about this, Kerby, and several times to think about. We're going to look at some data that looks discouraging, that looks like things are not going in the right direction. But I really think that we should not look at this as a cause just for alarm, but as an opportunity to communicate the gospel, to present it in a way to millennials, to young adults, in a way that penetrates the fog of the culture around them. And if you live in this culture, you know that this culture creates a fog.
Yes.
And it makes it hard to know what's true and what can you hold on to. But we as Christians know that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life.
Now, one of the things I actually ran into somebody that you were speaking to at the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. You spoke to all the leaders there, and he was saying if there's anything that Steve Cable's presentation really caused him to do is to recognize how important it was to present the gospel. He said, I learned a lot from your presentation because I realized a lot of these younger evangelicals, the emerging generation, the millennials, different phrases we'll use today to identify them, maybe don't even understand what the Christian message is all about. And so your presentation, if nothing else, just caused him to rethink even the way in which they present some of this at the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I think that's also going to really cause some of our leaders in the churches listening to this today to think about how they're going to present the gospel and how they're going to reach out to this next generation.
I think that's a great point, Kerby, that as we're sharing, as we're worshiping with, as we're interacting with people from the younger generation, we need to realize that we need to ask questions that are beyond just the basics. Do you believe in Jesus Christ as your Savior? Oh, yes, of course I do. Do you believe that Jesus Christ died for you and he gave his life for you, and that he's the only way in which you can be reconciled to our Heavenly Father? Well, that's a different question.
Yes.
Well, I don't know, because I have a lot of friends who aren't Christians and they don't have a Christian background. So, no, I don't really think that's true. Well, that's an issue, because you're not going to be evangelical if you don't believe that everyone needs Jesus.
We're going to take a break and come back and get into that a little bit more. And one of the things I want to talk about is, why is it that some of these researchers, for example, came to different conclusions? I've got this particular article here that was in World Magazine, an interview with one of the people you mentioned, sociologist Bradley Wright. And maybe he was just looking at the top level, but as you dig down deeply, you find a little bit different. So first of all, we're going to try to resolve, are we in a situation where some of these millennials and these emerging adults are moving away from Christianity, or is everything okay? I think you already sort of have a pretty good understanding of that. But then what does that mean in terms of the way in which you teach and preach in your churches, and what does it mean in terms of having an effective outreach to the next generation? Again, we have in studio with us today Steve Cable, the book that he has written, and it is a great summary of some of the material we're going to talk about. Cultural Captives. We have information about that on our website, and we've posted a number of articles that I think you'll want to download and print off if you want to understand more about what's happening around us. We'll take a break. Be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, some members of the current resistance movement are becoming more violent. We see the violence on university campuses and in rallies in major cities. But it's worth remembering that much of this started even before the election of Donald Trump. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement began to protest what progressives believe must change in the financial industry. John Nolte, writing in Breitbart, kept a running tally of the rap sheet of these protesters. At last count, he listed a total of 417 arrests or other offenses. Pollster Douglas Schoen found that 52% of the Occupy protesters had participated in a political movement before. He also found that nearly a third said that they would support violence to advance their agenda. We've also seen this in the environmental protest. Take the North Dakota pipeline protest, for example. Law enforcement officials collected 41 pages of social media posts written against the police officers that had to confront the demonstrators. They had the names, addresses, and pictures of the officers with threats to make their family pay. Earlier this month, police in Tennessee charged a woman with felony reckless endangerment after she came after a Republican member of Congress and attacked his car. An Obamacare supporter in North Dakota physically accosted a Republican member of Congress. One writer in the Huffington Post argued that elected officials, especially Republicans, should be hounded by protesters everywhere, especially in public, in restaurants, in shopping centers, in their districts, and yes, on the public property outside their homes and apartments. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was accosted in an Apple store. Omarosa was accosted while shopping in a Northern Virginia mall. We need leaders on both sides of the aisle to call for an end of the violence and call for everyone to practice civility. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Steve Cable, and if you would like to join us a little bit later, 1-800-351-1212. Again, the Senior Vice President at Probe Ministries, an organization, of course, I work with as well, and the author of this book, Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. Might just mention that our first article there, Examining Our Cultural Captivity, we'll get into that in a little more detail. Then an article on the rise of the nuns, which we've already illustrated and talked about and is in the April issue of the Outlook magazine. Then we have a section just on the trends in American religious belief. And probably near the second hour, we'll see how this goes, we have a whole section that Steve Cable has done on cultural research, some of which come from world value surveys. So even as we move away from the United States and from Christianity, we'll talk about what are some of the beliefs of Muslims and others. So I really encourage you to kind of sit back and take some notes. But at the same time, if you'd like to join our conversation, maybe you have a question or always wanted somebody who has dug into the details a little bit more to help answer some questions, or if you'd like to have someone maybe clarify this before you post a blog post or before you give a sermon, again, we have a contact information for Steve Cable. What about this? So I have this article here that was in World Magazine, interview with Bradley Wright. And he says, that really a lot of evangelicals tend to be kind of doomsayers, and he doesn't think that the problem with evangelical Christianity is quite as great, that young evangelicals aren't leaving the church in record numbers. But obviously, you said you've looked at the data. When you got down to the actual questions, you found that everybody that was doing these surveys were pretty much agreeing. So how do we sort some of that out?
Right. I think what we find is two things amongst those who come to the conclusion that things are continuing pretty much as they have in the past, and that we're doing pretty well with our young adults. And first of all is that they look at some basic questions about: do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you go to church sometimes? But they don't look at the more telling questions, like the one that's: do you believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven? Mm-hmm. Or do you believe that Muhammad and Buddha and Jesus are all ways to heaven? And this is something that we do have surveys that ask that type of question. And what we found was in our surveys that were between 2005 and 2010 that we used in my book, that about 90% of young adults who were not evangelicals were pluralists. That is, they believed, well, there's many ways to get to heaven.
Yeah.
The other 10% probably believe, well, there is no heaven. So, that sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Then you look at young adults who are evangelicals, and we found that 70% of young adults who were evangelicals were also pluralists. Wow. That there were many ways to heaven. And then more recently, in 2012, I've analyzed two different surveys from 2012, and in those surveys, they reported that over 76%, that's over 3/4 of evangelical young adults, are pluralist. There are many different ways to get to heaven, and Jesus is just one of them, which is mind-blowing when you think about it, because you think, oh, yes, well, God was sitting up in heaven one day, and he said, there's a lot of ways to get to heaven, but I think we need one more. Let's come up with one more. What could it be? Oh, I know what we'll do. We'll send my son, God, down to earth to live as a man, and we'll have him spit on, we'll have him whipped, we'll have him crucified and buried, because that just sounds like a fun way to add another option on how to get to heaven. Well, when you think about it in that context, it doesn't make sense at all.
Yes.
And yet we have over 3/4 of American young adults who are evangelicals that say, oh, yeah, there's many ways to get to heaven.
And that kind of gives us a couple of action points, because we always like to have action items on Point of View. And one of those is, if you're a pastor, if you're a Sunday school teacher, a Bible fellowship leader, a small group leader, you really need to talk about the exclusivity of Christ and about what it means to be a Christian. And Steve, there are probably some people thinking, well, then maybe they aren't evangelical. Maybe they aren't even Christians, because if 3/4 of them don't even believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven, maybe they're not Christians. Can you help us with the surveys when they ask in different surveys? And again, we're summarizing quite a number. You have a pretty good idea that these are individuals that have had a born-again experience, don't you, or not?
Well, that's true. We both Barna in their surveys and in our survey that they did for us, we specifically asked some questions to identify people that we would consider to be born again. Mm-hmm. And then in other surveys, you can find similar questions to find out, are these people born again? And in fact, when we did the analysis, we looked at born agains and we looked at evangelicals as two different groups.
Right.
They were about the same percentage of the population,
mm-hmm.
and their answer, and there was, pretty much the same people, but there were differences, and their answers were about the same. And so you have people who, if you ask them some basic question, you say, well, yeah, it sounds like you're born again, but their understanding of what it means to be a Christian and what a Christian, why God has us here on this earth, while we're remaining here on this earth, they haven't really thought it through, and they're confused by their friends and the culture around them because it's definitely not presenting a Christian worldview to them.
But again, there's an obvious implication to all of that, because if I am convinced that there are all sorts of other ways that a person can be saved, either emotionally because I have non-saved friends, I think, well, God will probably grade on the curve and bring them in too. That affects your view of evangelism. It affects your view of missions. I mean, why send missionaries to the unreached people groups, and why be involved in evangelism if, after all, God's probably going to save people even if they've never heard about Jesus Christ or never heard about the salvation that comes in the gospel?
Yeah, it really chops the legs out of the basic concept of evangelical Christianity and the very concept of Matthew 28 and Acts 1, 8, and 9, and the whole message that Jesus gave to his apostles that says, as you go, make disciples of all nations. Well, there's no need to do that if there are many other ways to get there. In fact, you're confusing people and you're mm-hmm. making it more difficult for them. I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh over a number of years, and I can tell you that the people that come to Christ there, they are just blessed from the standpoint of knowing, I now know who my God is. I now know what's going to happen to me when I die.
Sure.
And in general, their lives do not get better. They don't get a lot of money. They're
mm-hmm.
still desperately poor, but now they have an eternal purpose, an eternal view. And it's actually, in some sense, easier for them to understand the basics of Christianity than it is for someone in America who has, even though they may have grown up in church and they've heard the message and they generally believe it, but they have so much good stuff and so much to partake of, and so many friends who are, partaking at an even higher rate who don't believe in Christ, and it's hard for them to come to grips with the message of the gospel, which Jesus said, that the world is not going to accept the gospel, mm-hmm. that there's going to be a disconnect between the two. And we have a natural tendency, I think, to try to, let's see if we can't meld them together and find something that kind of works both sides. And it doesn't work.
Yes. Just before we take a break, let's talk about this idea of cultural captives. That's the title of your book, and it goes back to Colossians 2:8, doesn't it? Because there is a real concern, and cultural captivity might look different in Bangladesh than it does in the United States. But one of the things you found in your surveys is that if indeed you aren't thinking biblically about every area of life, if you don't have a Christian world and life view, then you will be easily, to use a different phrase, conformed to this world, or you will be taken captive by the culture. Isn't that what you're really trying to communicate here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I view these Christians who don't really apply their Christianity, don't really have it affect their entire life, the way they think about their relationship with God and the way they think about their relationship with other people. I clearly believe that they have been taken captive by the traditions of men, by the elementary principles of the world, as it talks about in Colossians 2:8, rather than by Christ. And that verse in Colossians is a verse to Christians. It says, some of you, Christians, are being taken captive by the traditions of men, by the elementary principles of the world, rather than by Christ. And we'd like to think, that's never going to happen to me. It's almost impossible not for it to happen to you to some degree, especially in a culture like America.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about at least one program that Probe Ministries has put together, and it came out of the research that was done by Barna Research Group and Probe Ministries. And then we're going to get into a discussion about the nuns, because this is another one, individuals who do not align themselves with any faith And what does that mean? And that is certainly one thing we've written about in the April issue of Outlook. We'll get into that. And of course, as I mentioned, in the second hour, we're going to even talk about some of these other religions and other faiths in light of some of the things that have come down from the World Value Survey. So we're going to cover quite a bit. But as we go along, if you have a comment or a question, of course, we welcome those phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Steve Cable, Senior Vice President with Probe Ministries, in studio with us today, author of the book Cultural Captives. We'll have more right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Oftentimes, this is our Millennial Round Table. Today, we're looking at some of the facts and figures and statistics affecting this emerging generation. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Steve Cable in studio with us, Senior Vice President with Probe Ministries. And along the way, I thought we'd also mention that there are some solutions. We've already mentioned a few, but one of the things we did at Probe Ministries was actually put together material based on your book, Cultural Captives, and a book that at one time was called Once Captive. Now we call it Periscope. We found people like that better. See Above, Live Beyond. And it's a 7-week series that you as a pastor, if you're a pastor, could give, or even as a small group. There's videos, there's all sorts of teaching, there's music to go with it as well. And Steve, the focus here is to recognize some of those decision points, some of those areas where this generation has maybe deviated from Christianity, and to bring them back to an understanding that they need an eternal perspective, to understand that they're engaged in a spiritual warfare, and then give them some of the facts and figures and statistics we're talking about here today. So if people are interested, if you click on the picture next to Steve Cable, that will take you to probe.org, or just go to probe.org. You can find out more about that 7-week series you can do in your own church. And I would highly recommend, Steve, that everybody, especially pastors, get a copy of Cultural Captives, because what it does is it summarizes all these different surveys. And if you say, well, I'm just a busy pastor, I don't have the time to read what is effectively 200 pages, you even have kind of a 2-page executive summary in here. So those are some resources we want to make available so that as people are listening to this and saying, well, this is pretty discouraging, are there any solutions? We certainly have provided one of them, haven't we?
Yes, we have. And the overall material that's provided for the church or the small group is really focused on helping someone answer the question, what's the difference between someone who says, well, I sure hope I go to heaven when I die because I think I've trusted in Jesus Christ, and someone who says, you know, I'm a citizen of heaven through the blood of Jesus Christ, and I'm temporarily assigned to this earth for a purpose to spread the love of Jesus Christ in this world. And so we provide them 7 weeks of material going through the basic issues and topics,
right.
Not the stuff of my study, but the things from God's Word that helps them understand the fullness and the richness of the true Christian life.
And again, this is something that I think would be helpful for you if you're a small group leader. There are small group materials, and there is a small group leader packet, as well as videos that you can show and music. If you're a pastor and you would like to have the entire church go through it, as we've had many churches do, that's something else. And we'll come back and spend a little more time talking about that a little bit later. But I did want to, as we go through some of this discouraging information, recognize that we also understand that there are some very helpful solutions. But I thought for just a minute we'd talk about the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, that is, those individuals who do not align themselves with any kind of faith. Now, Steve, you know as well as I do, there have been some that have looked at the rising number. As a matter of fact, our second article here is The Rise of the Nones, in which you document that and provide a week of radio programs that were actually put together on that topic. Sometimes people will say, well, it just might be that we have a lot more young people that are Christian, but they just don't identify with a particular denomination or a particular church. And you've looked at this and said, no, that's not the case. I hate to be discouraging, but this rising number of young people, especially millennials who don't identify with any faith, that's really a true...
In our cultural makeup, and what we discovered is, as of 2014, over 35% of young adults fall into this no religious affiliation category.
Wow.
And then if we add in those who say they're associated with something else, atheism, agnosticism, or another religion, we get to 43%.
43%.
So
wow.
In just a few years, we will have over 50% of young adults in America who do not say that they're Catholic or Protestant. They don't claim Christianity as their religion. And as you've said, and I've heard it said in conferences and other places, some people are trying to say, well, yes, but historically the young people have been less religious and they come back when they have children, etc. But what we've found over the last 8 years is this number continues to grow and grow and grow, and we don't see any statistical evidence of the people coming back. In fact, we looked at the GSS data, the General Social Survey from 2014, to look into this assertion that, well, the nuns are actually Christians who just have an aversion to identifying with a religious tradition. I don't want to be categorized. I don't want to be put in a box. But really, they really are Christians,
right,
are really involved in a Christian religion. And so we went to the GSS survey, and we looked at how many of the nuns in this survey say they actually attend a church at least once a month. And the answer was less than 7% of them. So 93% of them, more than 93%, do not attend church.
Mm-hmm.
Then we asked them, well, how many of these nuns say they believe in a God and believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God and believe in life after death? And the answer was about 1 out of 10.
Yeah.
So 90% of them do not believe that.
Yes.
And so then we said, well, how many of the nuns do both of those? They attend a church and they believe these 3 basic beliefs. And the answer was 1 out of 100.
1%.
1%. So 99 out of 100 nuns are not showing any outward signs of being kind of hidden Christians who didn't want to identify with Christ. They show all the signs of being somebody who's either known about Christianity and turned their back on it, or been brought up in another thought world and have not considered Christianity. And so,
so first of all, they're not going to church, and second of all, they aren't going to be bringing their kids to church if they get married and have children, right?
Right. In general, I mean, there'll be a few of them that do, but most of them will not. And the vast majority of nuns have broken away from order. Most are not believers keeping their identity options open. That's not what we find.
And again, they're a Bible fellowship leader, and that is sometimes there's the assumption that if we build it, they will come. Remember the old phrase, these nuns that may show up at a Christmas service, they may show up at an Easter service, but the reality is if you're waiting for them to come to you, probably not going to happen. You need to figure out ways to go to them. And so that means reaching out in the community, trying to do some various kinds of evangelistic outreaches, because a good number of these in the nuns, first of all, they may never have gone to church when they were young. So this idea that, well, they went to church and then they left, but will come back again. If they weren't in church in the first place, it's not likely they're going to be walking into the church later on. So that's why this is, I think, a very significant challenge, and maybe, again, calling for pastors and Christian leaders to kind of refocus what we're doing. Because what we're doing right now obviously isn't working very well, right?
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of what Christian Smith said based on his survey of the same group of young people over a 6-year period. And he said that basically liberal Protestantism has won the day. Whether they're evangelical background, mainline Protestant background, or Catholic background, the vast majority of them believe what liberal Protestants believe, which is basically everything I need to know about God I learned in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. And consequently, since I've learned everything already, I do not have any need for church. And so that particular branch of mainline Protestantism has the numbers attending of young adults has dropped dramatically. And Christian Smith is saying, and that's going to be true for this generation as a whole, because they bought into that teaching that Jesus was a good teacher and you can learn some good things from him. And once you go to Bible school as a kindergartner, you've got it. And you don't need to go anymore.
Yes. Well, again, we've had Ken Ham on and others that have actually, and Britt Beamer and others that have said, well, in some respects, they've already checked out by middle school. You know, it's not like that they went off to college and then lost their faith or gave up on their faith. Sometimes they already are kind of checked out a little bit. So when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about, especially as we get into some of these cultural issues, it seems to me that a lot of these so-called evangelicals think more like non-evangelicals. And again, back to some correctives, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about, okay, if we want to have an influence on this generation, which looks like it may be the most secular generation in American history, are there influences? What are some of the primary influences in those individuals? And then don't forget, in the second hour, we're going to move into some of these other very interesting religions as well. We'll talk about where is Christianity in Europe and where is Islam in the Middle East. And so we'll look at some of the material from the World Values Survey. But also, if you'd like to join us, let me open up the phones now, give you a chance. If you have a question or a comment, if you notice that as you look around in your church, don't seem as many young people around here. If you notice that as some of the young people go off to college, they don't come back to church at the end of the summer. And if you'd like to join us, we'd love to hear your comments and certainly entertain your questions. 1-800-351-1212. Steve Cable in studio. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork. But life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Steve Cable in studio with us today, Senior Vice President for Probe Ministries, author of the book Cultural Captives. And for just a minute, let's see if we can come back to some of the surveys by George Barna. He's sat in that chair here with us before and been with us a number of times. One of the things he's done is a survey recently, I just noticed, about how the beliefs of these other worldviews are really confusing the worldviews of practicing Christians. And as a matter of fact, I did a commentary that will air next week on some of that research. And I thought it was kind of interesting because when you look at some of these individuals that identify themselves as practicing Christians, sometimes they have views that all look a lot more like the new spirituality. What have you found in some of the research?
Right, exactly. We've recognized as we were doing our research over the last 8 years that, okay, if they don't have a strictly Christian worldview, then they've got to have these other views in there that are coming from other places, and they've put together a hodgepodge. And what Dave Kinnaman and the Barna Group did was they put together a survey to try to see, well, what type of views do they have? What does this mix look like? And so they started with 4 different worldviews: new spirituality, which is kind of new age type of view; postmodernism, those that don't believe there's not any real truth. It's whatever you believe and your friends believe is true for you, and if you believe something else, well, that's true for you and not for me, and that's fine. And then Marxism, which is still a big issue around a lot of the world today. And then secularism, which is a huge issue for those of us in America and Europe and a lot of places in the world. And they took those views and they went out and asked a number of practicing Christians. By practicing Christians, they meant people who attend church at least monthly and consider their faith as a very important part of their lives. Okay? So these are people that are actively doing something in a Christian context. And when they did this, they found that the majority of these Christians had a mixed worldview. It was not a consistent worldview. And just let me give you a few examples. They had one in there that says, our purpose is to become one with all that is. Well, if you know anything about religions, that's Buddhism.
Yeah.
You want to become one with the universal cosmos.
Right.
And 22% of those over 45 who were practicing Christians said, yeah, that's right. That's what my purpose is. But 38% of those under 45 said, yeah, that's my purpose. Become one with all that is. And then they had one that says, morality depends on what an individual believes.
Yeah, I've quoted that
very,
one.
very postmodern belief. And, only 16% of those over 45 of practicing Christians said, yeah, that's true. But 37% of those under 45 said, yeah, that's absolutely true. Morality depends on what an individual believes. If you believe something's right, it's right for you, and how can I tell you that it's not? Then there was one that says, a life is valuable only if society says so. Whoa, that's a dangerous slope to go down for abortion, euthanasia, a number of those things. And what they found was that only 7% of those over 45 said, yeah, that's right, but 28%. And then this one that's really very near to dear to us at Probe, they said, a belief has to be proven by science to know if it is true. In other words, science is the only arbiter of truth.
Right. And
only 3% of those over 45 who were practicing Christians said, yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
But 25% of young adults who are practicing Christians said, yeah, that's true. If it's not proven by science, it's not true. So they said, we're getting a better handle on this, but what we're seeing, and we're not surprised by it, is it's a hodgepodge of different views, different cultures mixing together to create something that is not Christianity.
Let's take some phone calls, and we'll head out to Texas, first of all. KBJS and Bob, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Steve Cable.
Well, I just had a brief comment. I'll try to make it brief. But I was telling a young lady that I am involved in 2 international ministries, the Gideons being one of them, and Child Evangelist Fellowship for another. But what I'm finding out in my personal witnessing is that it started some years ago, at least I can remember in my younger years, I did not witness. And that's the problem. Most believers do not share their faith.
Very true.
So we've ended up with a generation of young people who do not even know. Some of them don't even know the term being born again, and I'm 79 years old, and many of my brethren still do not share their faith, and I don't understand that, but they don't. And we have a lot of people that go to Bible studies, but they don't do anything with it.
You know, we had Mario Zanstra on with East-West Ministries the other day, and he was talking about, how the first time you share your faith, especially sometimes they'll get people in other countries and take them to a third world country, it just changes their life, because evangelism then, I think, is one other way to give you that eternal perspective. And like you said, Bob, if you aren't sharing your faith, you probably don't have vitality in your Christian life. And more importantly, you have a whole generation of young people, unless they've gone to Child Evangelism Fellowship or a Christian camp, maybe have never heard the gospel. Don't you think?
Yes, true. And I have heard, I have asked the kids in one of our Good News clubs, the third and fourth graders, I'd asked them, I said, give me a show of hands of you that went to Sunday school this past weekend. And maybe out of 30 or 35 kids, 3 or 4 of them raised their hands.
There you go. Yeah.
And I asked one little boy who's in the fourth grade. I said, he answered some of the questions we asked, so after the class, I said, son, how did you know the answer to that question? He said, oh, I just knew it. And I said, what, do you go to Sunday school? Oh, no, we don't go to Sunday school. Why should, now get this didn't come from the child. Why should we go to Sunday school and give up our weekends? That had to come from the parents. Well, so what they're getting, the only exposure they're getting to Christ is what we're giving them in that Good News Club.
Sad.
And another thing and what the gentleman was talking about the young people who may profess to be Christians, and after you examine them by asking them specific questions, and there are questions, although only God knows the heart, you can find out whether they're really born again or not. It's the best we can tell. And and that's consistent with what he's saying, is that they've been plastered with all of the world views of all this. Well, there's many ways to be saved. In fact, I've asked that very question.
Sure. Again, they're just getting confused with all these different worldviews. We have to have obviously a natural break here. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about that, and also get into this whole question of what is the primary influence. If we want to make a difference, it gets back to the parents, doesn't it? So we'll talk about that. Steve Cable in studio here. We've got a number of calls, and I will certainly give you first preference when we get back from the break so that you can ask some more questions. And if you just joined us, talking with Steve Cable, Senior Vice President at Probe Ministries, and he is the author of the book Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. And we've posted a number of his articles on the website today. Let me encourage you, especially if you're in a ministry like Child Evangelism Fellowship or something of that nature, to download those, print them off, and learn a little bit more. We'll be back with more right after these important messages.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty, greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take up wide-ranging apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, and this is oftentimes the day in which we have our Millennial Round Table, which we will have next week, but we thought today would be very good to give you a little bit of a statistical analysis and a look at some of the surveys related to the emerging adults. And so we have in studio with us Steve Cable, Senior Vice President with Probe Ministries, author of the book Cultural Captives, The Beliefs and Behavior of American Young Adults. We also have posted a couple of articles, one on examining our cultural captivity, one that we talked about last hour, the rise of the nuns, and then we'll get into, maybe finishing off some of the trends in American religious belief, and then a whole section on cultural research. We'll look at some of the views of other religions like Islam from the Pew Research Study and World Values Survey and the rest. But if you've been with us in the last segment, we had a call from Bob and talking about being involved with the Gideons and Child Evangelism Fellowship. And if nothing else, Steve, it's just to remind us again that young people oftentimes don't believe the gospel because maybe they've never heard the gospel. They don't go to church. Their parents don't go to church. And so it reminds us once again that you've done some research to figure out what are some of the primary influences on some of these young people. What have you found?
Yeah, you would expect that when you look at emerging adults or young adults, that as they in that life stage, the people that are most likely to hear the gospel from would be other young adults.
Yes.
But what we found is we've surveyed evangelical young adults is that, number one, as we talked earlier, they have a pluralistic worldview. They think, well, there's many ways to get to heaven, and Jesus is one of them, and why should I waste somebody's time or make them upset by talking to them about Jesus when their way is just as good as my way?
Right.
And the second thing that we found is, well, how do they get to this idea where they allow pluralism to trump the basic teaching of Christianity, where Jesus says, no one comes to the Father except by me? And so we actually went out and asked born-again young adults a question that set on what were the primary influence on their religious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they get their religious beliefs? And you're not going to be too surprised to hear that that the vast majority of them, over 70% of them, it was their family.
Yes.
And for the majority of those, it was their mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you have that good thing that Christian mothers are passing on the faith to their children. But then you think about, well, how's it going? What's the result of that? And you say, well, maybe we're not doing such a good job of passing on the faith to our children because our children don't really have the faith. They don't really understand what it means to be a Christian. And so the first lesson we have from that is that as parents, as people who are bringing children to this world, if we have a concern about the gospel of Jesus Christ and about raising up children who understand it and know it, we need to be verbal about it. We need to be talking about the truths, the basic beliefs of a Christian on a daily basis in front of our children and to our children, because otherwise they go to church, they hear the pastor speak, and they say, well, that's kind of weird, and it must not be important because my parents never say anything about it.
Right.
And so what's more important, what some pastor says or what my parents talk about? Oh, it must be what my parents are more important to me. And so as a parent, that should really ring true, ring strong in your heart that says, I need to be verbally speaking the truth to my children and not expecting the Sunday school or the pastor or someone to take that role for me, because your children are not going to allow you to do that. They're going to look to you in most cases. Now, one thing we found that was very interesting, though, was that if they indicated that their father and mother or only their father was the primary source, they were twice as likely to hold a biblical worldview. Okay, fathers out there, you need to listen to this. If their father was the primary source of their religious beliefs, they were twice as likely to have a biblical worldview. Fathers, if your wife is teaching them about the Bible, teaching them a biblical worldview, and you're not involved, you're off doing your own thing, you think, well, they're taken care of. No, they're looking at you, and you're making a difference by not saying anything. But if you do say something, your children are twice as likely to grow up and hold to a biblical worldview, which is what we need so desperately in America today.
And I was just thinking about that, because if a dad is not involved, then it sort of says, especially to the boys, well, it's optional, or, maybe you go as a Sunday school class, but by the time you get to be a teenager, dad's not involved, so I don't need to be involved. And that's one thing. The other implication of this is when you did a survey, I also noticed that as much as we'd like to think the youth leader was important, they were further down the list. And there's a tendency, Steve, sometimes for parents to say, oh, I don't need to talk to them about the Bible. I'll drop them off at church, and it's the youth leader's responsibility. And what we found is that doesn't work very well either, does it?
Right. It seems like a good idea. We've got someone whose job it is to do that, and that's going to work really well. But what the fact of the matter is, it does not work well. Now, we did find one other thing interesting in looking at this, and that is that today in the 21st century, a college graduate who's influenced by a source other than their family, they say, it was a pastor, it was things I studied, it was things I read, it was a group at college that set my spiritual beliefs. They are a third more likely to be a regular church attender with a biblical worldview than a college graduate whose primary influence is their family. And they're 110%, in other words, more than twice as likely than a young adult who did not graduate from college. That's a shocking result, because in the 20th century, when I was growing up, when I was in college, all the surveys showed that you were much more likely to, if you went to college, to lose your faith than if you didn't go to college and went to a career. But today, you don't have to go to college to have your faith trashed. Right. You don't have to go to college to have your faith questioned. Just go to school. Just go to high school. Just watch television. Just read a magazine. Just go on the internet. Any place you go, you're going to find your Christian faith questioned, talked down about, and so now we're seeing this shift that says if you're reaching out to them in college, if you're providing them answers to their questions, it really makes a difference. And so we're seeing this trend now where the college graduates are more likely to be church attenders with a biblical worldview than those who did not attend college, or those who were still relying upon their parents' influence as college students. That's a very interesting result, and it's encouraging, actually, to those of us that have opportunity to work with college students. So 2 things out of this. Number 1, fathers and mothers, you need to verbalize your faith if you want to pass it on to your children. Not just once, not just twice, but on a regular basis. And number 2, those of you that are working with college students and young adults, this is a great opportunity. You can make a difference.
Again, just shows the legacy of Crew and Navigators and Baptist Student Union, InterVarsity, and others. Let's take a break. We're going to talk about Islam right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, some members of the current resistance movement are becoming more violent. We see the violence on university campuses and in rallies in major cities. But it's worth remembering that much of this started even before the election of Donald Trump. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement began to protest what progressives believe must change in the financial industry. John Nolte, writing in Breitbart, kept a running tally of the rap sheet of these protesters. At last count, he listed a total of 417 arrests or other offenses. Pollster Douglas Schoen found that 52% of the Occupy protesters had participated in a political movement before. He also found that nearly a third said that they would support violence to advance their agenda. We've also seen this in the environmental protest. Take the North Dakota pipeline protest, for example. Law enforcement officials collected 41 pages of social media posts written against the police officers that had to confront the demonstrators. They had the names, addresses, and pictures of the officers with threats to make their family pay. Earlier this month, police in Tennessee charged a woman with felony reckless endangerment after she came after a Republican member of Congress and attacked his car. An Obamacare supporter in North Dakota physically accosted a Republican member of Congress. One writer in the Huffington Post argued that elected officials, especially Republicans, should be hounded by protesters everywhere, especially in public, in restaurants, in shopping centers, in their districts, and yes, on the public property outside their homes and apartments. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was accosted in an Apple store. Omarosa was accosted while shopping in a Northern Virginia mall. We need leaders on both sides of the aisle to call for an end of the violence and call for everyone to practice civility. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in studio with us, Steve Cable, and we've been talking up until now about Christianity. We're going to change the topic and get into Islam because there are some really interesting surveys that have come out from Pew Research on that. It'll be a good setup for some of the conversation we're going to have tomorrow. We have by phone an individual that was a person who shot Osama bin Laden, and then we're also going to be spending a little bit of time with Gary Fraser in studio talking about the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War. So we'll be talking about Islam tomorrow. But I thought since we have Steve Cable here, we've been talking about the emerging generation and talking about millennials. But for just a few minutes, I thought we might get into this issue. So, Steve, tell us a little bit about what you've learned kind of from analyzing some of these surveys of Muslims, because this is an issue that we need to understand. One, in terms of evangelism, how do we reach our Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers? But number two, to really understand this war on terror that we're engaged in. So these Pew Research studies have told us a lot more about what's in the hearts and minds of these Muslims, right?
Right, and I think that's very important because just as most Christians in America do not understand what's going on with young adults and their relationship with Christ today, we really don't understand what's going on in the Muslim world. And right. we see pictures of it from various things that are going on, and those are important. But the broader question of what is happening in the Muslim world and how can we reach out to them with the Word of God and with the truth of Jesus Christ is more important question. And so Pew did a survey in 2011, 2012, where they interviewed over 30,000 Muslim people in 26 different countries. Not in America, but in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and in Europe. And they asked the people to describe their religious beliefs and practices and sought to gauge their knowledge of and attitudes toward other faiths, as well as some of their attitudes concerning cultural issues. And so, we said, this is something that we need to understand, and we need to look and see what they really learned. And so the first thing we looked at in the survey is the same thing we look at when we look at the Christian surveys, and that's, what is their worldview? What are the basic beliefs that drive the way they look at the world that they live in? And so if you're familiar with the work, you know that Barna defined 6 different questions that they use to define a Christian worldview. And so we use 6 questions that the survey asked to define what we consider to be a Quranic worldview. Instead of a biblical worldview, a Quranic worldview. And those questions were, number 1, I believe in one God, Allah, and his prophet Muhammad. Number 2, I know a great deal about the Muslim religion and its practices. Number 3, in heaven, people who have led good lives are eternally rewarded. In hell, people who have led bad lives and die without being sorry are eternally punished. 5, I believe in angels and in jinns, which are spirit beings similar to demons. And number 6, I believe Islam is the one true faith leading to eternal life in heaven. And that's a pretty good set of basic beliefs for a Muslim to have. And so we looked at this survey of 30,000 Muslims, and what we found was that across all those countries, 20% of the Muslims believed those 6 basic truths of Islam. 20%. That means 20%. 4 out of 5 did not have a basic agreement with the basic tenets of Islam, which then kind of reminds us, well, that sounds a lot like Christianity in America today, because we found that for young adults in America, about 25% of them have a biblical worldview. And here we found for Muslims across the world that about 20% of them have a Quranic worldview. And just as an aside, on this topic, for Muslims, there's really no difference between 18 to 29-year-olds and those that are older. Wow. It's consistent across all ages. There's a different culture there where it's not the same type of culture we have in America.
So again, it's just as we sometimes have what we call cultural Christians here, that a person says, well, I'm a Christian, and what does that mean? Really, not much. I was born in the United States, and I've been to church once, and so I guess I'm Christian, I'm not Muslim. The same sort of thing seems to be happening, and again, this is in 26 different countries, so again, you're giving us the top line. We'll get into some of the details, but you have the same sort of thing, where I grew up, and so Islam was kind of a cultural experience. But if you ask them, what do you really know about the Quran? Do you read the Quran? Do you really believe some of the basic tenets of Islam? They aren't any more educated about their faith than a lot of Christians might be.
Even more so than in America. In America, not now, but in the latter part of the 20th century, there was a cultural Christianity. And if you wanted to do well in your community, you wanted to have the right connections, then you need to be able to say, this is the church I go to.
Right.
And so you had to have some association with Christianity, even though many people did not really believe the doctrines of Christianity. In the Islamic world, it's even much more of an issue, because in most Islamic countries in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Bangladesh, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in the town in which you live, in the village in which you live, it's not just, it helps me to be a Muslim. No, I must be a Muslim if I'm going to have any chance of having a good life, to have a successful business, to have a successful family life, because anything other than that is going to be second class or worse. So there's a huge pressure to say I'm a Muslim, but there's not that much pressure to say, and do you know what that means?
Yes. And again, part of that has to do with the fact that, we talk about people that say, I believe the Bible. Have you read it? No, I've never read the Bible. But in this particular case, it's more difficult because the Quran is written in kind of an older version of Arabic. And again, many of the people living in these countries don't even know Arabic. And even if they know a little bit, they may be illiterate. So it may be, in some respects, even more so, where the imam may be much more important simply because they can't really even or have not really read the Quran and really do not know what's in it. True.
That's absolutely the case. I spent a lot of time in Bangladesh. I spent a lot of time in India and other countries that have a significant Muslim population, and I found that to be very true.
So again, what else have you found out in terms of sort of the differences? Because we look at sort of the top level, but as you move your way down and tried to sort out these 30,000 face-to-face interviews, what else did you finally discover?
Well, the other thing that we look at with Christians is then, do they have a religious practice that matches their worldview, or do they not have a worldview and don't have a religious practice either?
Right.
And we felt like in understanding Muslims, we needed to look at that as well. And so we looked at two different things. The first thing we looked at, and if you understand anything about Islam, you know that if you're going to be a good Muslim and you have a chance of getting into heaven, then you must follow the 5 pillars of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And the 5 pillars of Islam are, number 1, declaring there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Which, by the way, when we asked that question, most of the people, the vast majority of them, they said, "Oh yeah, I got that one." It was the other ones where they didn't understand. The second one is you have to pray 5 times each day. Now, different sects, some pray 3 times a day, but the basic thing is praying 5 times each day in Arabic, quoting from the Quran. Number 3, fasting during daylight hours of the month of Ramadan,
which we're right now.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think most of you now in America know about Ramadan. You know, when we were growing up, Ramadan we said, well, is that kind of fruit or something?
Yeah.
But I think most people in America know Ramadan is a month of religious fasting by Muslims. Number 4, give 2.5% of their income for the poor and for the cause of Islam. And number 5, to complete the Hajj, which is a ritual pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, when we looked at this, we looked at that and said, well, how many people are doing these things? You know, and we said, okay, we looked at the data and we said, we're gonna ignore the Hajj. Other 4, I know we're about to run out of time in this segment. And we said, how many people do that? And what we found is, for all those surveyed, 40% of the respondents claim to practice these 4 pillars. So only 20% of them believe the basic doctrines, and only 40% of them practice the 5 pillars that you must do to get to heaven. I don't know what the other 60% are kind of thinking, but I think they've given up. But they need to say they're Muslim in order to be accepted in their village, in their town, in their society.
Well, let's take a break. We'll come back and talk a little bit more, not only about the religious practice, but another measure was how important it was, whether they pray or read the Quran or attend the mosque and give and some of those things. And we'll get into a couple of their aspects. And again, if you'd like to join us, so we've moved on to some of the other surveys that help us understand a little bit more about Islam. And that is a conversation we have so often here at Point of View. And since we have Steve Cable in here giving us some of the research done by Pew, we wanted to give you that opportunity. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
However you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, Steve Cable, who is Senior Vice President for Probe Ministries, also the author of the book Cultural Captives, The Belief and Behavior of American Young Adults. Let me just mention all the resources we've posted today. This is really just a goldmine of material. One article, a week of radio programs on examining our cultural captivity. Another one on the rise of the nuns. And in the first hour, we spent some time covering that. And if you weren't able to join us, I would encourage you to maybe listen to the podcast of the first hour, because it really begins to identify some of the real issues that we need to address in the church. Talked about Periscope, which is a program to really help you see above and live beyond. And this is going to be, I think, a very important program that your church or small group can be involved with. And you can find all of that at probe.org. We'll talk more about that before the end of the program. Then we have a whole section on trends in American religious belief. And the fourth one, which we posted there, is just kind of a catch-all category called Cultural Research by Steve Cable. We're kind of at the moment looking at Islam. I noticed already we have 15 different articles in there. So you can spend a long time and dig pretty deeply into some of this. But Steve, just before we took a break, we were talking about some of the religious practices of Muslims. And again, this comes from a survey of over 30,000 face-to-face interviews with Muslims in 26 different countries. But what did you find in terms of how important religion was to some of these Muslims?
Right. So as we talked before the break, we looked at the 5 pillars of Islam, which are the basic things that every Muslim should be doing if they're going to be faithful and have a chance of entering into paradise with Allah. But we can look at things also that are really just a part of a religious life, and we're going to look at some things that we can then compare to Christians in a similar way. And so we looked at these following 6 things. How important is religion in your life? And on the average, do you attend the mosque at least once a month or more? Outside of religious services, do you pray at least daily? When they're supposed to pray 5 times a day, so hopefully it would be that. How often do you read or listen to the Quran? Do you do it at least once a week? Do you give a percentage of your wealth to charity or the mosque? And how much does the way you live your life reflect the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad? Mm-hmm. So these are things that if you were a devout Muslim would be important to you, and you think you would try hard to apply those in your life. And what we found in these 30,000 people that were interviewed across all respondents, only about 12% of them practiced these 6 activities. It tells you that the vast majority of people who identify themselves as Muslims in the world are not identifying themselves because they practice Islam, but because they were born into a Muslim culture, and it's advantageous to be a Muslim, and you wouldn't want to be anything else from a cultural standpoint. Now, one interesting thing about this is that, unlike the basic beliefs, in the practices there is a difference between the young people. And so of about 12% of all this 30,000 practice these 6 activity, probably about 6 to 8% of 18 to 29-year-olds practice them. So we are seeing that kind of movement off, where religious practices are not as important to the young adults. Whether it's a different dynamic with the Muslims than it is with American Christianity, it's hard to say. But then when we compare that to American Christians, that have the same type of question about how often do you attend church? Do you pray daily? Do you read your Bible once a week? And in a 2012 survey, Portraits of American Life, when we're looking at that one, which is a fairly recent survey, we found that about 5% of 29 to 30-year-old Christians had these basic practices, and about 10% of those over 30. That's very similar to the Muslims in their practice of the basic tenets of their religion. So we're actually seeing that there's a tremendous opportunity here to share the gospel, to share the good news, both with quote-unquote Christians in America and with Muslims around the world, because the vast majority of them have no buy-in, no involvement in the faith that they claim with the name. It's just a name. And we found in working in some countries around the world that you find that they're very open to the good news of Jesus Christ, to the good news that in Jesus Christ paid the price. He met the standard of perfection that God has to get into his heaven, and that no amount of good works that we can do will ever turn the scales in our favor. And that's what they, as a Muslim, have been told that they must do. They must do enough good to outweigh the bad so the scales turn in their favor. And when they learn there's no way they can do that, but that Jesus Christ has paid the price for them, that he has paid it all, that by grace through faith they can receive eternal life. We've found that many of them are excited and open about this good news.
You know, one of the things, another application point in terms of this is to not assume that when you're sharing your faith with somebody who calls themselves a Christian in this country or a Muslim in this country or overseas, if you do a short-term mission trip, it's probably better to ask some questions and see what they know, because what you're finding is that most American Christians and most of these Muslims that are around the world, they may be sort of semi-identified with a religious faith, but they really don't understand it, and they really aren't necessarily hostile to your gospel presentation because they really don't have these firm convictions that we sometimes have. Not that it wouldn't be wise to, learn a little bit more about Islam, but you don't necessarily have to know that much about the Muslim faith, because in some cases you may be witnessing to Muslims who don't know much about the Muslim faith either.
That's absolutely the case. And of course, if I've talked with Muslims who know a lot about the Muslim faith, and then it's kind of the same approach in that you're asking then, well, then how much good do you have to do? At what point do you feel confident that you have pleased Allah enough that he's going to let you into his heaven? Apart from blowing yourself up as a martyr and killing tens of people, how much good do you have to do? And when they start talking about that really opens up the opportunity to say, well, let's look at this other standard. Let's look at what, you've heard of Jesus Christ. Well, let's see what the gospel, the Injil, as they call it, says about what Jesus did for us on the cross. And so in either case, there's a good opportunity to talk to them about that.
So again, some of that will be available in some of your material as well. And it just occurred to me that we might, just before we run out of time, we'll take a break here in just a minute, but even before we get into the break, talk about what's happening in Europe. We're coming to the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And so if you were to go to Germany, the home of Martin Luther, you go to, say, Switzerland or other places, the home of John Calvin. You think of the Netherlands and the home of Abraham Kuyper. You would think that there would be obviously some spirituality, some religious views. But again, looking at some of the surveys, I guess these come from the World Values Survey, you have pretty much found what we've concluded, and that is, although Christianity was really vibrant on the European continent, doesn't seem to be so now, does it?
Right. It reminds me of the famous book by the Welshman that God has no grandchildren, about the Welsh revival. And we see this in a very stark way when we look at the survey data on the religious beliefs in Germany and Norway and Sweden. The survey that we had available on this does not get into the detail of the type of questions we normally ask to look at a biblical worldview. But you can look at a religious view. Do you believe in God? Do you believe that there's a heaven or a hell? That type of basic belief. And what we found was that among American Protestants, of the questions that we looked at there, 29% of American Protestants would say yes, we believe those things, and 2% of the citizens of Germany, Norway, and Sweden believe those.
2%.
And then when you say, well, do you have you pray, and are you a member of a church? And we found that 2.8% of them did that. And so when we said, well, do you do all of the above? And it was 1.4%. In other words, 99% of people in Germany, Norway, and Sweden don't even claim to be a Christian, don't even have enough knowledge of Christianity to even say what it consists of. And that is that's sad when we think about where our religious forefathers came from.
Yeah, 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Hard to find any Christians in Europe. We'll take a break, continue our conversation with Steve Cable right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Governor Bill Haslam of Tennessee has signed into law a measure protecting the religious liberty of Tennessee's student athletes. The new law allows parents to opt their students out of participation in an athletic contest if the event is on an official school holiday, observed day of worship, or religious holiday. Moreover, it sets the authority aright by explaining that school officials may not require a student to attend an athletic event over the parent's objection. Some wonder how necessary such a measure is. They argue that schools already respect the religious choices of student athletes and do not punish those students who, for religious reasons, sit out of scheduled contests. That, I suppose, is a debate for the ages. Whether athletes should participate on holy days is not a new issue. Just watch the classic movie Chariots of Fire as but one example. Nonetheless, it is good to see the state of Tennessee explicitly stating that its school districts should be mindful that there are things to be respected of higher importance than sports. Athletics can teach students much about life, diligence, and teamwork. But life balance is a critical element taught by sports in school as well. Today's student athletes are tomorrow's business leaders who may be required to accommodate the religious practices of employees. Let us hope they learn the delicate balance of freedom well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and we might be able to slip in a phone call, 1-800-351-1212. Have in studio with us Steve Cable. And again, we have lots of resources available to you on the website, pointofview.net, or you can just go directly to probe.org. I'm going to give you another website in just a minute called upperiscope.com. We'll get into that for a second, but let me first of all just mention some of the resources that we have. This is really to equip you. If you're a pastor, a Sunday school leader, a small group leader, we have, for example, this article, Examining Our Cultural Captivity. It's a week of radio programs that Steve Cable has done on this issue of cultural captivity. And of course, his book, Cultural Captives, is part of that. Then The Rise of the the nuns? What about this idea of those who show really no religious convictions? They do not align themselves with any particular faith. That's available. Then we have sections which have trends in American religious belief, and then a whole catch-all category of cultural research by Steve Cable. There's like 15 articles in there already. So there's just a lot of great material there, if nothing else. And we also have been talking about the Periscope material. So if you say, I would really like in my small group or my church to have access to some of these videos that you've put together, the sermon outlines, the music. There's a CD done by a Dove Award-winning artist and all sorts of other resources. You can go to upperiscope.com, or you can just go to probe.org. It will link you there in just a minute. But the attempt is to, in a full church program, to have 7 sermons and then to have people read the book on Periscope, which allows you each day to read something that reinforces what you've heard in the church. Then there's a small group material. There's all sorts of booklets. There's CDs and all sorts of resources. So, Steve, that's one of the things we want people to do. Go to the website, upperiscope.com. And one of the things I always say is watch the video. There's a video there. It's about 2 minutes long. You can watch it. Then click that and maybe click the share button, send it to your pastor or send it to a friend and get them having a conversation about how to turn some of this around, because we've been talking about some of the discouraging statistics about the emerging generation, and we certainly have seen this church in small groups.
Right, and one of our objectives with the material was to help to reach out to the about 60% of born-again emerging adults, young adults, attend church at least once a week. Now, the majority of those do not have a biblical worldview, but some of them do. And we wanted to reach out to them to help them get a grasp of what it meant to have a biblical worldview and how that could change your life and make your life more rich and fulfilling. One of the exciting parts that we have in the Periscope material is that all your participants can receive a daily email or voicemail.
Right.
That's a subset of the message in the book that encourages them each day. And we found that most of the people that are doing the study, that really resonates with them, that they can connect every day, and they get a reminder to think about the truths of God's Word and to think about the difference that they can make in the world around them each day through a simple email or voicemail. And that's been an exciting part for us. And one of the interesting things we've learned is that millennials, young adults, really love the voicemail. You would think, well, how can that be? I have millennial children, and I can't call them on the phone.
Yeah.
They don't answer their phone. I got to text them if I want to get hold of them. But you see, the voicemail is different because it's something that you get on your phone, and then you can listen to it whenever you want. And so when they're driving along the road or they're doing something else, they can listen to it. It's actually easier for them to do than it is to read an email. And so, surprisingly to us, we found that the millennials tend to like getting a daily voicemail, something they can listen to for 1 or 2 minutes that encourages them and helps point them in the right direction for the day.
Let's take some phone calls. We talked about what's happening over there in Europe, and I think James in Oklahoma, KDJR, wants to talk about a ministry there in England. So, James, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I worked on a hovercraft expedition and developing hovercraft to work on, third world countries in the late 80s and early 90s. We actually took a couple of hovercraft over to China, the upper reach of the Yangtze River, to explore there. But while I was in England, I visited several Church of England, and up to the time I'd been there, you hear about, boy, the Church of England is dead as a doornail. But it varied greatly. There were some that were dead, a great big cathedral with 5 or 6 people in it, and or, then a vibrant one. I went to... A friend of mine was going to school at Oxford, and he asked if I wanted to, sit in a class. I said, sure, I did that, And then that evening he said, we're having communion. Would you like to come? Great. I tell you what, I don't think I've ever felt the presence of God so palpable, during that service, and it was interesting how they do it. But just, you felt God there, and you were talking about, it's pretty dead. these people that I were working with were Baptist. They had a little church that met in a school building, and the pastor was up there. He was, excuse my English, scaring the hell out of them, kind of thing, But there is a spark there, and it's amazing to me that
God has His remnant everywhere. You find it in England or any other country, but it is sad. I'm sure you would agree with me, James, that when you think about the great Protestant preachers and the reformations that took place in some of these different countries in Europe, it's kind of a shadow of its former self. So we need certainly be praying not only for our own country, but praying for the Christian outreach there, even in Europe. Don't you agree?
Oh, I agree totally. It's for sure. What's the spark? 10, 12%, something like that. But it is there, and that was amazing to me that I found something like that. So it was. Did missionary flying from Canada to Costa Rica and everything in between, and I'd like to hog tie a bunch of people and just haul them down to a little little Spanish church in Mexico. They don't come for a half hour or something like that. They come for all day because they walk.
They're all day. Yeah. Steve shaking his head because you've seen that as well. We're just about out of time, and I thought, Steve, a couple of things. First of all, we are encouraging people to go to upperiscope.com, or else you can go to probe.org. Either way, of course, you can find the links at pointofview.net. But if individuals say to themselves, well, I'd like to take some, or I'd like to do a blog post or a Facebook post, or maybe pastors are saying, I would like to preach a sermon on this, but I want to get it right. Is there a way that they can communicate with you and check out some of the facts and figures we've been going over the last 2 hours today?
Right, certainly that. I would love for them to do that, and they can reach me at scable@probe.org. That's probably the easiest way. You can call me at Probe at 972-941-4563, and I'd be happy to talk to you.
And again, those are resources that we made available to you. And at the end of each one of your articles, I think you have your website and your email, so there's some material as well. Well, Steve, we've quoted from you before, and as a matter of fact, the most recent one, the April Outlook, and I appreciate you giving us 2 hours today on our Millennial Round Table.
Very happy to do it.
Well, again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back tomorrow, we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of very important issues. Robert O'Neill will be with us. He is the man that shot Osama bin Laden, so we're going to hear from a Navy SEAL. Then we're going to have Gary Fraser in studio with us, and he's going to spend some time reminding us that it is now the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War, and so we'll talk about that. Friday will be our weekend edition. Penna Dexter will be here, Chelsea Yeoman, and so we have all sorts of resources that we will put in your hands. But take the time today to go to the website, pointofview.net, find these various articles by Steve Cable, and I know that you will benefit from that as well. I want to thank Andrew and Alisa, as well as Melissa, for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. See you back here tomorrow on our Thursday program. We'll see you then.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.